in the building. All right, let's talk a little bit about allergens. Well, I said that spores are allergenic. And in fact, for them to be allergenic, they really need to be on the surface of the spore, or at least the materials inside the spore need to be exposed in some way, because most of the allergenic responses rely on interactions between the allergens and the human immune system. Spores are mostly responsible. Okay, well, so what are the things that are allergenics? Well, components of the fungal cell walls, those are known to be highly allergenic. There are, because of the way fungi work, it turns out there are lots of proteins, various kinds of enzymes that are trapped in the fungal cell walls, and these also could be highly allergenic. And finally, unique to the fungi, there is a special class of small proteins that coat the outsides of the spores, which are incredibly water repellent, widely present throughout a large, major subgroups, the fungi, and these, it turns out, indeed are also allergenic. These are called hydrophobins. So what about mycotoxins? Well, I will tell you that not all fungi make mycotoxins, but the ones, unfortunately, the ones that are often concerned with mold do, particularly species of Aspergillus and Penicillium. Now, most of the literature we have in mycotoxins in these fungi comes from the food industry, because the same fungi that occur in moldy houses also occur frequently infesting foodstuffs. And of course, if you've got a moldy apple or a moldy orange, it's unlikely that you would eat it. But if it's some sort of manufactured foodstuff, it might well be that that mold could get incorporated into the ketchup, for instance. I'm told the allowances of mold in ketchup are rather shockingly high. And so these are places where mycotoxins could be a concern for human consumption. The point has been made that if you're breathing in spores, the chances that you would get a large enough dose of mycotoxins to cause some sort of systemic poisoning of the body, it's inconceivable that would happen. Because the amounts you're breathing in are really incredibly small by comparison with what you might eat in moldy food. And that's true, but, there are other things that can happen besides systemic poisoning. There are, of course, the immune system is nothing if it's not a gigantic system for amplifying biological effects. And there are substances produced in the lung cells called epithelins, which trigger all sorts of nasty immune responses. And the release of these things can certainly be triggered by mycotoxins, which are breathed in with spores. Furthermore, some of the mycotoxins, for instance, aflatoxin, which those of us who eat peanut butter here might well be concerned about, produced by Aspergillus flavus, are among the most mutagenic substances known. And mutagenic substances are very often also carcinogenic. So, of course, it only takes one cell to become carcinogenic in order for you to eventually have a problem. So mycotoxins are certainly important from that point of view. There are other things that certain fungi, not all of them, but certain fungi do. Now, some of them make substances which impair the immune system and damp it down. In one case, namely the notorious black mold Stachybotrys, it's now been demonstrated that, in fact, the mycotoxins in Stachybotrys kill neurons in the nose. And in fact, so that is an effect which you certainly would not wish to incur on yourself or your tenants. I'll come back and talk about Stachybotrys in more detail later. Okay. Well, so now what about human pathogens? By pathogens, I mean something that you're exposed to and it makes healthy people sick. Well, there are fungal primary pathogens. And in fact, when I used to teach my college, my lecture was always right before lunch, and I really had a collection of pretty gross pictures, which detailing the possible effects of human systemic mycotic infection. They really can be horrible. Although I'm happy to say that in the 5 years we looked at samples from moldy houses, never once did we turn up a human pathogen. And by and large, human pathogens don't show up inside houses unless you've got those starlings nesting in your garage or something like that. We picked up one once in the air from New York City, and that was the only time we ever saw anything. Even when we were asked to look for San Joaquin Valley fever, for instance, we never saw any of those things. So I think the concern about primary pathogens is something that those of us in the room here really don't need to worry about when you're talking about molds. Now, having said that, there are some fungi, most notably species of Aspergillus, particularly Aspergillus fumigatus, which are what are called opportunistic pathogens. That is, if you're dealing with people whose immune system is compromised for some reason, AIDS, or organ transplant, diabetes, old age, you can think of many conditions which would lead to immune system impairment. These people can be attacked by these opportunistic pathogens. And Aspergillus can cause very serious infections in the lungs, for instance. So this may not be so much a concern for individual landlords who rent individual dwellings, but if you are in the business of leasing public space, for instance, then indeed you do need to be worried with the fact that anybody, including immune-compromised people, could walk through the door. So that can be a real concern. So that's what I want to say about disease. Yes, some of these things may cause disease in some people, but in fact they're rare. And that really is in conflicts between tenants and landlords revolving around molds. That's almost never the issue. Well, let me say a little bit then about how you would know whether you have mold in your house. Well, I suppose if you're a landlord, the first thing you would hear is that your tenants are complaining. And these complaints can run all the way from runny noses to things which are much more serious. So I'll insert a little story here. When I signed on to be chief scientist for Moldworks, I had mostly a theoretical knowledge about these fungi. I'd never seen most of them, to tell you the truth. And so the first 6 months were a very steep learning curve. One of the things which started showing up in our samples fairly regularly was Stachybotrys, which is the notorious black mold. And I'd read certain warnings about this fungus that ought to be handled with respect, but I was a little cavalier about it. But I did notice it didn't smell very good, and it caused a burning sensation in the nose, all right. And then after about 6 weeks, I started noticing that I was getting unexplained nosebleeds with unexpected frequency. And I decided that I would be a little more careful with Stachybotrys. And that is well warranted, because nosebleeds are, for instance, one of the common symptoms associated with Stachybotrys infestation in houses. When people report that, we found it was almost invariably true that Stachybotrys would be found in the samples. So sick people are certainly something that landlords should pay attention to. Now, if you want to go further, there's nothing that can beat an experienced building inspector or a mold inspector. Experienced building inspectors, we found, were almost always the most reliable clients to deal with.